Ripples of Fate. Chapter 8, Hand. John honestly expected to be housed in White Sword Tower, like the other squires and Kingsguard. But it turned out there were no available rooms in the tower, so he was offered a room in the Tower of the Hand, which was currently occupied by his father and his northern retinue, consisting of over 200 guardsmen of House Stark and 24 servants from Winterfell whom his father had taken south with him. And to be honest, John wasn't all that upset by the fact that he was living in the Tower of the Hand and not the White Sword. After all, after he finished his duties, he could spend more time with Arya and Bran. And of course, with Ghost, since dire wolves were only allowed to roam freely in the Tower of the Hand. John had even heard rumors that Queen Cersei insisted that such dangerous beasts as dire wolves should be kept in enclosures, along with the dogs. But his father managed to convince King Robert not to do this, promising him something like the wolves would only be kept in the Tower of the Hand. John still couldn't understand how his father and the king could be best friends. His first disappointment in the king came the moment he rode through the gates of Winterfell. John expected to see the man his lord father had described, a mighty and invincible warrior, the demon of the trident. But instead, he saw a portly king, so fat that John wondered how his black war gelding could support him. But later, when he began serving as Ser Barristan's squire and thus began spending more time with the king, John began to wonder even more how such different men as his father and Robert Baratheon had become such close friends. While his father was a paragon of honor except for himself, of course, justice, and integrity, King Robert Baratheon was a completely different man, immersed in drunkenness and debauchery, and completely uninterested in the affairs of his kingdom. John knew from his father and Ser Barristan that King Robert had never attended a single meeting of the small council, preferring to do so in his chambers, with the aforementioned debauchery with whores and drunkenness. John firmly pushed those thoughts aside. He's your king, and your lord father's best friend, and you have no right to judge him, he repeated to himself every time he dismissed thoughts of the king's obvious incompetence. And the best place to dismiss any such thoughts was in the Red Keep's training yard, where he currently stood, along with dozens of other knights and their squires who had begun arriving from all over the kingdom for the tournament in honor of the so-called Tournament of the Hand. Although his father had been the most opposed to it, sourly calling it the king's tournament and a waste of money. But John himself couldn't deny the fact that he wanted to see this tournament, as it would be his first ever. After all, such events weren't held in the north because there weren't as many knights north of the neck as in other parts of the realms. His sisters and younger brother were equally excited about the upcoming tournament. This was especially true of Bran, who was most looking forward to seeing it in person. If there are so many knights here from all over the kingdom, perhaps my father will assign me to one as a squire, Bran told them at breakfast today. This elicited a playful eye roll from Arya, which made John laugh. Another plus in his life was that here, far from Lady Catelyn, he was allowed to sit at the same table with his brother and sisters, much to the dismay of Septa Mordane. Today, he had managed to spar with 4 men, all of them squires like himself, 2 from the Stormlands, 1 from the Riverlands, and 1 from the Reach, and to his great satisfaction, he had emerged victorious every time. After the last sparring session, John sat down on a wooden bench, drenched in sweat, and took a sip of water. And just then, a young man approached him, about his age or perhaps a little older. "Pretty good for a northerner," the youth said with a smug grin. "You're a northerner, the bastard son of Ned Stark, aren't you?" John nodded and looked the boy over, head to toe. John could confidently say that if Sansa were in his place right now, she would blush at the boy's beauty. A handsome man, slender, with dark hair and brown eyes, dressed in a green silk tunic. "Yes," John nodded. "And you?" "Ser Loras Tyrell," the boy replied. John's eyes widened slightly. He had heard stories at court about Loras Tyrell, better known as the Knight of Flowers, knighted a couple of months ago by King Renly Baratheon's brother. "I saw your sparring, and I must say, it was quite good," Loras said smugly. "Now I understand why Ser Barristan himself took you as a squire." John shrugged indifferently. Probably, John replied. I suppose. Oh, that's northern modesty, Loras chuckled and paused. Well, if you want, I wouldn't mind a sparring match. Well, come on, sir, John said, rising from his seat. Just Loras, Loras grinned at him. Robert headed for the tent exit. Robert, Ned called out, glancing at his friend's huge, exposed belly. Robert, in turn, burst into furious laughter. A fine example for his subjects, isn't it? Bow to your king, you bastards. Robert said, laughing. After breakfast with Robert, Ned accompanied the king to the battlefield. Ned was glad that common sense had prevailed over Robert and the king had abandoned his foolish plan to participate in the tourney. He glanced at the royal box where Robert sat, holding a horn of wine. To her husband's left sat Cersei, with her elaborate hairdo, and next to her sat Crown Prince Joffrey. On the other side of the king sat Prince Tommen and Princess Myrcella. 3 Kingsguard stood guard over the royal family, Ser Barristan, Ser Mandon, and Ser Aerys. He pushed his way to where his family sat. Sansa, Arya, Bran, and even Jon were all sitting and watching the rest ale where the final bout of the jousting tournament was about to take place. Ned sat between Arya and Jon as the trumpets blared, announcing the next pair of knights. Knight of Flowers, Sansa breathed, looking toward the approaching youth. The young knight's silver armor was polished to a mirror shine, embellished with grapevines and tiny blue forget-me-nots made of sapphires. A heavy cloak draped over his shoulders, woven from the same forget-me-nots, completed his look. Boasting and nothing more. Ned thought to himself as a Tyrell knight rode up to their stand and handed his eldest daughter a red rose. The gesture made Sansa's face turn almost the same shade as the rose itself, and a shy smile played across her face. "Thank you, Ser Loras," she muttered. The young knight nodded at her with a smile, though Ned didn't miss the boy's brown eyes darting slightly higher. "Good luck," Jon said with a slight smirk. "My opponent will need it," Larys snorted and grinned at Jon. "But thank you all the same, Jon." The Knight of Flowers led his horse to the center of the lists. "Good luck, the Knight of Flowers, will need it after all," Ned thought to himself as the boy's opponent rode out onto the Restal. Ser Gregor Clegane, known as the Mountain Rider, sat atop his obsidian black war merman that it looked like a pony under Gregor. Ned knew that this man had participated in the purge of the Targaryen children, and that it was Gregor who had smashed the infant Aegon Targaryen's head against the wall, and then raped his mother, the Dornish Princess Elia, before slicing her in half. The realization that little Aegon was Jon's older brother made Ned's heart ache. "Let Ser Gregor not hurt him," Sansa said, turning to him, her blue eyes filled with worry. "These are tourney lances," he explained to his daughter. "They break when struck, they leave no wound." However, Ned's memory flashed to the body of the young knight Hugh, lying on the table. "Don't worry, Sansa, you saw yesterday that Ser Larys is a fine rider," Jon told her soothingly. Although Ned noticed Jon's grey eyes were fixed on a single point, when Ned followed his son's gaze, he cringed inwardly. After all, Jon's gaze was fixed on Gregor, and Ned didn't like the way his son's eyes had darkened. "100 golden dragons for the mountain," Littlefinger announced loudly, addressing Renly as the competitors rode to the far ends of the arena to take their spears. "Well, another 100 golden dragons certainly wouldn't hurt me." Renly laughed. "So it's a deal." Yesterday, during the squire competition, the king's brother, to Ned's surprise, bet on his son to win. The sound of horns rang out. And the rivals urged their horses toward each other. The mountain's horse broke into a heavy gallop, the Knight of Flowers' white mare flowing toward him like a stream of silk. The mountain thrust forward his massive shield and spear, simultaneously trying to rein in his unruly steed. And at that moment, Loras Tyrell appeared beside him and, with a single blow from his tourney lance, knocked the mountain from his saddle, his horse's weight collapsing as well. Ned heard applause, cheers, whistles, exclamations, and excited whispers. Renly laughed loudly. "Well, Littlefinger, I'm 100 dragons richer today." Out of the corner of his eye, Ned saw Littlefinger's face twist as if he'd swallowed a lemon. By then, Clegane had already clambered out from under his horse and, seething with rage, leaped to his feet. He tore off his helmet and slammed it on the ground. His face darkened with anger, and his hair fell into his eyes. "Sword!" he shouted furiously at his squire, and the boy ran up to him with the weapon. The next moment, Gregor approached his horse and, with a single powerful blow, severed its head. And at that moment, the heartbeat-inducing cries of joy turned to panicked shrieks. The stallion's headless body fell to its knees and then sprawled across the restale. And Gregor had already turned and stepped toward Ser Loras Tyrell, clutching his huge, bloody sword. At that moment, John, who had been sitting next to him, climbed over the railing in the blink of an eye and headed toward the mountain, already drawing his blade. At the last moment, he had to reach out and catch Arya before she ran after her foolish brother. "Stop him! Stop him!" Ned shouted, unsure whether he was talking about John or Clegane. Sansa was crying, Bran was paralyzed with fear, and Ned hugged his youngest daughter tightly, as she kicked, screamed, and cried.
Friends, if you watched this video to the end, and you are interested in this topic, then subscribe, like, and comment.